In a small town in Oregon, Mike Reynolds ran a modest auto repair shop while raising his young son alone. On a stormy Friday evening, when most mechanics had closed their shops, Mike chose to help a mysterious woman whose car had broken down in the pouring rain. This simple act of compassion would trigger a chain of events that would transform not only his struggling business, but his entire life in ways he never could have imagined. The steady drumming of rain against the workshop's metal roof had become a familiar melody to Mike Reynolds. He stood in his office at Reynolds Auto Works, staring at the stack of unpaid bills illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights above. Outside, the October storm showed no signs of letting up, matching his gloomy mood as he calculated the month's expenses for what felt like the 100th time. "Dad, I finished my homework." Tommy's voice echoed from the small break room where he'd set up his after-school workspace. Mike smiled despite his worries, grateful that Gloria Martinez next door was willing to pick up his 8-year-old from school and watch him until the shop closed. Being a single father and a small business owner was a delicate balancing act, one he'd been performing since losing his wife Sarah to cancer 3 years ago. "Great job, buddy. Let me see what you've got there," Mike called back, pushing aside the threatening letter from his parts supplier. He'd figure something out, he always did. The military had taught him that there was always a solution, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. His years as a mechanic in the Army had given him not just technical skills, but an unwavering determination to overcome obstacles. Marcus Wilson, his young apprentice mechanic, poked his head into the office. "Boss, I finished up Mrs. Thompson's brake job. Want to check it before I close up?" The 22-year-old had been with him for 6 months, and Mike saw potential in him, even if he couldn't afford to pay him what he deserved. "Yeah, give me a minute," Mike replied, running a hand through his dark hair, still cut in the military style he'd maintained since his service days. The shop wasn't exactly thriving. Being located in Riverdale, Oregon, meant dealing with fierce competition from larger shops in nearby Portland. But Mike took pride in his honest work and fair prices, even if it meant sometimes struggling to make ends meet. The window rattled as another gust of wind drove rain against the glass. Mike thought about the upcoming weekend. Tommy had a soccer game tomorrow morning, assuming the weather cleared up. His sister Jenny had offered to take Tommy for the afternoon so Mike could catch up on paperwork, but he hated missing time with his son. "Looking rough out there?" Marcus commented, glancing at the darkness beyond the shop's bay doors. "Probably won't get any more customers today. Want me to start cleaning up?" Mike nodded, checking his watch. It was nearly 6, and he'd promised Tommy they'd make pizza together tonight. As he walked over to inspect Mrs. Thompson's car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Jenny confirming tomorrow's plans, he thought. Instead, an unknown number flashed on the screen. Mike hesitated. He usually let unknown calls go to voicemail this close to closing time. But something made him answer. "Reynolds Auto Works," he said, having to raise his voice slightly over the sound of rain hammering the roof. "Oh, thank goodness someone answered." A woman's voice came through, tense with worry. "I've called 6 other shops, but they're all closed. My car just died on Highway 26, and I have no idea what's wrong. I'm not from the area, and Her voice cracked slightly. "I really need help." Mike closed his eyes for a moment. Tommy was waiting. Dinner needed to be made, and he'd promised himself he'd tackle those bills tonight. But he could hear the genuine distress in the woman's voice, and he thought about Sarah, about all the times strangers had helped her when he was deployed. "Where exactly are you on Highway 26? He asked, already reaching for his keys. He could hear the relief in her response. "About 2 miles east of the Riverdale exit. I managed to pull onto the shoulder, but it's raining so hard, and the traffic—" "I know exactly where you are. Sit tight, keep your hazards on, and I'll be there in about 15 minutes. Whatever's wrong, we'll figure it out." As Mike hung up, he caught Marcus watching him with a knowing look. "Want me to stick around, boss?" Mike shook his head. "No, head home, I've got this one. But first, could you help me get Tommy's stuff together? I'll drop him at Gloria's on the way." As he prepared to head out into the storm, Mike had no way of knowing that this rainy evening would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. Sometimes the biggest changes come disguised as simple moments of kindness, and this was about to become one of those moments. The drive through the rain-slicked highway was treacherous, with Mike's wipers working overtime against the downpour. Tommy sat quietly in the back seat, clutching his backpack as they pulled up to Gloria Martinez's modest house. The retired teacher stood in her doorway, her warm smile visible even through the curtain of rain. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm so sorry to impose," Mike started, but Gloria waved away his apologies before he could finish. "Nonsense, Mike. Tommy and I will make those sugar cookies he's been asking about." She wrapped an arm around Tommy's shoulders as he rushed to her porch. "You go help whoever needs you. That's what makes you special, just like your Sarah was." The mention of his late wife squeezed Mike's heart, but he managed a grateful smile. "I shouldn't be too long. Just a stranded motorist on Highway 26. "Take your time," Gloria called after him. "Tommy and I have plenty to keep us busy." Back in his tow truck, Mike navigated carefully through the worsening storm. The rain hammered against the windshield with increasing intensity, and the highway's lights created ghostly reflections on the wet asphalt. His headlights caught the flash of hazard lights in the distance. A sleek black car pulled over on the shoulder. As he pulled up behind the vehicle, Mike could make out the distinct shape of a new model Audi. Definitely not local, he thought, noting the government plates. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and raincoat, stepping out into the downpour. A woman emerged from the driver's side, wearing what appeared to be an expensive business suit, now partially soaked despite her small umbrella. She was around his age with an air of authority that seemed at odds with her current vulnerable situation. "Reynolds Auto Works?" she called out over the sound of passing trucks and rain. "That's me, Mike Reynolds," he replied, approaching with his flashlight lowered to avoid blinding her. "What seems to be the problem?" "Emily Harrison," she introduced herself, extending a hand despite the rain. Her handshake was firm, professional. "The car just died while I was driving. No warning lights, no strange sounds, just completely shut down. I managed to coast to the shoulder." Mike nodded, already moving toward the car's hood. "Let's take a look. Better get back in your car where it's dry. This might take a few minutes." The engine compartment of the Audi was a familiar sight to Mike. He'd worked on plenty of high-end vehicles during his military service, maintaining officers' cars for extra income. His flashlight beam swept methodically across the engine components while rain dripped from his coat. After a thorough inspection, he knocked on the driver's window. Emily rolled it down, her expression hopeful. "Good news and bad news," Mike said, wiping rain from his face. "Bad news is your alternator's shot. Good news is I can fix it, but not here in the rain. I'll need to tow you to my shop." Emily's shoulders slumped slightly. "How long will the repair take?" "I have an important meeting in Portland tomorrow morning. Once we get to the shop, about 2 hours," Mike calculated. "I have the part in stock." He didn't mention that it was the last one he had, or that he'd been saving it for another customer's car scheduled for next week. He'd figure something out. "You're sure you can fix it tonight?" There was something in her tone, not quite desperation, but a hint of urgency that seemed out of place for a simple business meeting. "Yes, ma'am. Military mechanic for 8 years. I've fixed worse in worse conditions." The words slipped out automatically, and he saw something change in her expression, a slight shift in how she looked at him. "Military?" she asked, but a passing semi-truck drowned out anything else she might have said. "Let me get you hooked up," Mike said, already moving to position the tow truck. The rain had soaked through his coat now, but years of working in all weather conditions had taught him to ignore such discomforts. As he worked to secure the Audi, he caught glimpses of Emily making phone calls in her car, her conversation serious but inaudible over the storm. There was something about her demeanor that reminded him of his commanding officers, a kind of controlled intensity that seemed at odds with her story about a simple business meeting. With the car secured, Mike helped Emily transfer to his truck's passenger seat. Up close, he noticed details he'd missed before, a small pin on her lapel he didn't recognize, the way she scanned her surroundings with subtle but practiced awareness. "Your shop's not far?" she asked as he started the engine. "About 15 minutes, the storm slowing traffic down." He adjusted the heater, noticing she was shivering slightly. "There's a coffee shop next door if you want to wait somewhere warm while I work." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I prefer to stay close to my car if you don't mind," she replied, that same hint of something unspoken in her voice. Mike nodded, focusing on the road ahead. In his rearview mirror, the Audi's hazard lights pulsed rhythmically, creating intermittent flashes of amber in the rain-streaked darkness. Something about this situation felt different, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. As they drove through the storm, neither of them could have known that this rain-soaked evening was about to set in motion events that would reshape both their lives, and that the real story was only beginning to unfold. The lights of Reynolds Auto Works cut through the rainy darkness as Mike pulled the tow truck into the shop's main bay. The storm had intensified during their drive, making the familiar neon sign above the entrance flicker and dance in the downpour. He carefully maneuvered Emily's Audi into position, the wet tires leaving dark tracks on the concrete floor. Emily stepped out of the truck, her eyes scanning the workshop with that same analytical gaze Mike had noticed earlier. The space was modest, but meticulously organized, a habit he'd carried over from his military days. Tools lined the walls in precise arrangements, and despite the late hour, everything was clean and orderly. "Nice setup," she commented, running her finger along a spotless workbench. "Most shops I've seen aren't this well maintained." Mike smiled as he lowered the Audi from the tow truck. "Old habits die hard. My CO would have had my head if I'd kept my workspace anything less than perfect." He caught a flicker of recognition in her eyes at the military terminology, but focused on positioning the car. The shop phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Gloria. "Tommy wants to know if he can have another cookie," she said, amusement in her voice. "He says it's payment for being such a good helper with the baking." Mike chuckled, aware of Emily watching him as he talked. "One more. But that's it. And tell him I'll be home as soon as I can to hear all about it." "Take your time, dear. He's having a wonderful time." Gloria's voice was warm with affection. After hanging up, Mike moved to the Audi's hood, now under the bright shop lights. Emily stood nearby, her wet business suit gradually drying in the warmth of the garage. "Your son?" she asked, her tone casual but interested. "Yeah, Tommy. He's 8. Mike began diagnosing the alternator, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Sorry about the delay in getting home to him. His aunt was supposed to watch him tonight, but this storm changed everyone's plans." Emily's expression softened slightly. "It must be challenging, running a business and raising a child." "His mother passed away 3 years ago," Mike found himself saying, surprised at sharing such personal information with a stranger. "But we make it work. Got good people helping out." Something shifted in Emily's demeanor, a subtle change he might have missed if he hadn't been trained to notice details. She pulled out her phone, checked something, then put it away with a slight frown. "How long were you in service?" she asked, watching as he began removing the failed alternator. 8 years, vehicle maintenance division, but we handled everything from Humvees to officers' personal vehicles." He paused, glancing at her. "You seem familiar with the military." A slight smile crossed her face. "You could say that." She didn't elaborate. As Mike worked, they fell into an easy conversation about cars, his shop, and the local area. Emily asked questions that revealed a surprising knowledge of mechanics, though she deflected when he commented on it. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, creating a peaceful backdrop to their talk. An hour into the repair, Mike's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Boss, check the local news. Major military convoy coming through tomorrow. Might mean more business." As he read the message, he noticed Emily typing rapidly on her own phone, her expression focused. The coincidence struck him as odd, but he returned to his work. The new alternator fit perfectly, and he began the final connections with practiced precision. "You know," Emily said suddenly, "not many shops would have stayed open this late to help a stranded motorist." Mike tightened the last bolt. Couldn't leave someone stranded in this weather. Besides, I know what it's like to need help and not know who to trust. Learned that overseas." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The military teaches us a lot about helping others, doesn't it?" The use of "us" wasn't lost on Mike, but before he could respond, the shop's exterior lights caught a flash of movement. Through the rain-streaked windows, he glimpsed a black SUV cruising slowly past the shop, its headlights off. Emily noticed it too. Her posture changed almost imperceptibly. Alert, focused, she checked her phone again, then looked at Mike with an expression he couldn't quite read. "How much longer on the repair?" she asked, her tone now carrying a hint of urgency. "Just need to test it," Mike replied, increasingly certain that there was more to the situation than a simple broken-down car. "Something wrong?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just anxious to get back on the road." As Mike closed the hood and prepared to start the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this rainy night was about to become even more interesting. The black SUV made another pass, slower this time, and Emily's hand moved instinctively to her purse. The real story, he suspected, was just about to begin. The steady hum of the Audi's engine filled the workshop as Mike ran his final diagnostics. Everything checked out perfectly, but he noticed Emily's attention wasn't on the car anymore. She stood near the shop's front windows, subtly watching the street through rain-streaked glass, her body language tense despite her attempt to appear casual. "Test results look good," Mike announced, closing the diagnostic tablet. "Alternators functioning at optimal levels. You should be all set for your meeting tomorrow." He wiped his hands on a shop towel, studying her reflection in the window. The black SUV had passed by twice more during the repair, each time with its headlights dimmed. Emily turned back to face him, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "What do I owe you?" She reached for her purse, but Mike caught the way her eyes darted to the window again. Years of military training had taught him to recognize hypervigilance when he saw it. "Parts and labor come to $435, he said, moving toward his office to write up the invoice. The sound of tires on wet pavement caught his attention, another vehicle moving slowly past the shop, this time a dark sedan. Emily followed him into the office, closing the door behind her. The small space was cramped but orderly, with Tommy's crayon drawings decorating one wall and his military service photos on another. She noticed a particular photograph, Mike standing next to a line of armored vehicles in Afghanistan. "Vehicle Maintenance Division," she said softly, studying the photo. "But not just regular vehicles, right? Special modifications for special units." Mike's hand stilled over the invoice. "How did you—" "Because I was there," Emily interrupted, her voice low and urgent. "Not in your unit, but I know the work you did. Those modified vehicles saved lives during sensitive operations." She turned to face him directly. "That's actually why I'm here." Before Mike could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Gloria. "Black cars driving past the house. Should I be concerned?" Mike's protective instincts kicked in immediately. "What's going on?" he demanded, all pretense of casual conversation gone. "Who are those people out there and why are they watching my shop? And now, my house." Emily's professional facade cracked slightly, showing genuine concern. "I didn't want them anywhere near your home. I'm sorry about that." She glanced at her watch. "I have about 3 minutes to explain before they make their next pass. Here's the short version. I'm not here for a meeting in Portland. I'm here because we need your help, specifically your expertise with modified vehicles." "We?" Mike asked, though he was already putting the pieces together. "I'm with the Pentagon's Special Projects Division," Emily said, pulling out a small identification card. "Those vehicles you worked on? We've been developing next-generation versions. But there's been a security breach. Someone's trying to steal the technology, and they've already compromised our usual channels." The sound of another vehicle passing made them both tense. Emily continued quickly. "The people watching us are a private military contractor. They're hoping I'll lead them to our secure facility. but I need to get there first with the data I'm carrying." She patted her purse meaningfully. Mike processed this information with the quick efficiency his military training had ingrained. "And you need someone who knows the old systems to help with the new ones." "More than that," Emily said. "We need someone we can trust. Your service record is impeccable, and more importantly, you've demonstrated integrity even after leaving the service. Like tonight, staying open late to help a stranger, charging fair prices despite your own financial struggles." Another text from Gloria made Mike's phone buzz. 2 men in suits just walked past the house. Mike's jaw tightened. "They're getting bolder." He looked at Emily. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I need to get to a secure facility near Mount Hood. The road there." She hesitated. "Let's just say it requires someone with very specific driving and mechanical skills. Skills you have." The implications were clear. This wasn't just about fixing a car anymore. This was about national security and possibly danger. Mike thought about Tommy, about his responsibility as a father. But he also thought about his responsibility as a soldier, even a former one. "If I help you," he said carefully, "I need guarantees about my son's safety." Emily nodded immediately. "Already arranged. There's a protection detail waiting for my signal. They'll ensure your son and anyone close to him is secure." The sound of engines outside grew louder. Multiple vehicles now. They were running out of time. Mike made his decision. "The storm's getting worse," he said loudly, for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. "Maybe you should wait it out here for a while." Emily caught on immediately. Yes, perhaps that would be best. As they spoke, Mike was already texting Gloria instructions to take Tommy to a specific address, a safe house he'd set up years ago, just in case. Some habits from his military days had never quite faded. Now he was glad for that paranoia. The rain continued to pour outside, but now it felt less like an inconvenience and more like cover. Mike Reynolds, who had thought this would be a simple late-night repair, found himself slipping back into a familiar mindset, one where every decision could mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death. The night was far from over. The next few minutes moved with practiced precision. Mike quickly gathered essential tools and slipped them into a waterproof bag, his movements efficient and purposeful. Years of military service had taught him how to prepare for unexpected missions, though he'd never thought he'd need those skills at his small-town auto shop. "Your car's too obvious," he said to Emily, leading her toward the shop's back area. "They'll be watching for it." He pulled a tarp off a vehicle tucked away in the corner, a modified black Jeep Wrangler, lifted and fitted with heavy-duty off-road equipment. "This was my project car. Built it myself, including some unofficial improvements." Emily's eyes lit up with professional appreciation as she examined the vehicle. Reinforced suspension, run-flat tires, hidden storage compartments, just like the ones you used to modify for us. "Old habits," Mike said, checking his phone. A message from Gloria confirmed they were en route to the safe house. "Following your instructions. Tommy thinks it's a special adventure. Stay safe." The sound of car doors slamming outside made them both freeze. Footsteps approached the front of the shop, accompanied by the soft squeak of expensive shoes on wet pavement. "Back door," Mike whispered, grabbing his go-bag. "There's a service alley that—" A sharp knock on the shop's front door interrupted him. "Mr. Reynolds?" a male voice called out. "We'd like to speak with you about your late-night customer." Emily was already moving toward the back door, her movements silent and practiced. Mike followed, pausing only to hit the shop's master power switch. The lights went out, plunging the building into darkness broken only by the dim glow of emergency exits. They slipped out into the rain just as the sound of breaking glass came from the front of the shop. Mike led them to the Jeep, helping Emily in before sliding behind the wheel. The engine started with a low, powerful rumble he'd specifically engineered to be quieter than stock. "They'll have the main roads blocked," Emily said, checking something on her phone. "How well do you know the back routes?" Mike allowed himself a grim smile as he eased the Jeep into the dark alley. "I grew up here, used to race these back roads as a teenager. Now I use them for test drives." Shouts erupted from the shop behind them, followed by the sound of running feet. Mike kept the headlights off, navigating by memory through the narrow service alleys between buildings. The rain worked in their favor, reducing visibility and muffling the Jeep's sounds. 2 vehicles at the north intersection, Emily reported, watching her phone. Another moving to cut off the east exit. They don't know about the old logging roads, Mike said, taking a sharp turn that led behind a row of warehouses. There's a whole network of them through the mountains. Used to maintain equipment up there during my dad's time. The Jeep's tires gripped the wet pavement as they emerged onto a wider street. In the distance, headlights swept across the rain, their pursuers searching the main roads. Mike turned away from them, taking them deeper into the industrial district. Your son, Emily said suddenly. The safe house. Is it really secure? Former Army Ranger runs it, Mike replied, navigating around a fallen branch. Met him during my second tour. He owes me more than a few favors. He checked his mirrors. Gloria knows the protocols. Tommy's probably already enjoying hot chocolate and thinking it's all a great adventure. A black SUV suddenly appeared at the end of the street, its headlights blazing to life. Mike reacted instantly, cutting down another alley. The sound of squealing tires behind them confirmed they'd been spotted. How good are your unofficial improvements? Emily asked, gripping the handle above her door as Mike took another sharp turn. Good enough to lose them, he answered, his focus absolute. But first we need to get to the logging roads. After that. He patted the custom console between them. This Jeep has a few surprises they won't be expecting. The chase was on, through rain-slicked streets and dark alleys. With Mike's intimate knowledge of the area, their only advantage against pursuers with superior numbers and resources. But as they raced through the storm, Mike couldn't help but think about how a simple act of kindness, helping a stranded motorist, had thrust him back into a world he thought he'd left behind. And somewhere in the back of his mind he wondered if he'd ever truly left it at all. The rain intensified as they approached the outskirts of town, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the deluge. Through the storm, the dark shapes of the Cascade Mountains loomed ahead, their forested slopes offering both sanctuary and challenge. 2 more vehicles joining the pursuit, Emily reported, her voice steady despite the situation. They're coordinating their movements professionally. These aren't just corporate thugs. Mike nodded grimly. I noticed. Their driving patterns, the way they're trying to hurt us, military trained. He took another turn, this one leading to an almost invisible service road. Good thing I learned from the best. The Jeep's powerful engine roared as they climbed a steep incline, mud spraying from all 4 tires. Mike had spent countless hours modifying this vehicle, never quite able to explain to himself why he needed such extensive upgrades. Now he knew. Some part of him had always sensed that his old life wasn't quite finished with him. Behind them, headlights bounced through the darkness, their pursuers refusing to give up the chase. But with each turn, each carefully chosen path, Mike was leading them exactly where he wanted them, away from town, away from Tommy, and into terrain where his knowledge and modifications would make the difference between escape and capture. The night was far from over, and the real test of his improvements was about to begin. The old logging road twisted upward through dense forest, its muddy surface churned into treacherous ruts by the pounding rain. Mike handled the Jeep with practiced precision, years of experience guiding his every move. The modified suspension system he'd installed absorbed the brutal terrain, while custom mud tires gripped the slick ground with surprising tenacity. They're falling behind, Emily observed, checking her phone's display. But 3 vehicles are still on our tail. The others are trying to circle around, probably hoping to cut us off higher up. Let them try, Mike said, a hint of confidence in his voice. He reached over and flipped a hidden switch on the custom console. The Jeep's regular headlights dimmed, replaced by military-grade infrared illumination. Night vision, he explained, pulling down a modified visor. Borrowed the idea from our old convoy runs. Emily raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. You've kept up with the technology. Had to, Mike replied, navigating around a fallen tree with practiced ease. These mountains get dangerous in bad weather. Search and rescue teams can't always reach stranded vehicles quick enough. He paused, checking his mirrors. Though I admit this isn't exactly what I had in mind when I installed it. The pursuing vehicle's headlights grew more distant as the terrain became increasingly challenging. Mike's modifications and intimate knowledge of the logging roads were proving invaluable. Each turn took them deeper into the mountain wilderness, away from civilian areas and potential casualties. "Your son," Emily said suddenly, her voice softer than before. "You said he's 8? "Yeah," Mike answered, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Tommy. Smart kid, too smart sometimes, notices everything, asks questions about everything." A fond smile crossed his face despite their situation. "Reminds me of his mother." "You mentioned she passed away," Emily said carefully. "I'm sorry." "Cancer," Mike replied, his voice steady but carrying old pain. "Sarah was a fighter, though. Gave us an extra year the doctors said we wouldn't have, made sure Tommy would have memories of her." A particularly violent jolt interrupted the conversation as the Jeep powered through a deep mud pit. The pursuing vehicles were barely visible now, their lights dim specks in the darkness behind them. But Mike knew better than to relax. In his experience, this was often when situations became most dangerous. His instincts proved correct as Emily's phone suddenly lit up with new alerts. "They're mobilizing helicopters," she reported, her professional demeanor returning instantly. 2 of them, launching from a private airfield near Portland. "They really want whatever you're carrying," Mike observed, taking them around a hairpin turn that hugged the mountainside. Rain continued to pour, creating small waterfalls across their path. "What I'm carrying could revolutionize military vehicle technology," Emily explained, bracing herself as they bounced over a rough patch. "But in the wrong hands, it could also compromise every secure military transport system we have." Mike processed this information while navigating another treacherous turn. The mountain rose steep and dark on their right, while a sharp drop-off lurked on their left. The racing thoughts in his head weren't just about escape routes now. They were about Tommy, about Sarah, about the life he'd built and whether he'd made the right choice getting involved. "We've got about 20 minutes before those helicopters become a problem," Emily calculated, studying her phone's display. "Ideas?" Mike allowed himself a small, confident smile. "A few. There's an old mining complex up ahead. The entrance collapsed years ago, but the access road is still there. More importantly," he reached for another hidden switch on the console, "the surrounding terrain is perfect for what I have in mind." "Which is?" Emily asked, noting his expression. "Let's just say this Jeep has a few more surprises. Some things you never forget, like how to disappear when you need to." He checked his mirrors one last time. Better hold on tight. This is where it gets interesting. The Jeep surged forward into the stormy night, carrying them toward what Mike hoped would be their salvation, or what could become their biggest mistake. Either way, there was no turning back now. The game of cat and mouse was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The access road to the old mine appeared ahead, barely visible in the darkness. Years of disuse had left it overgrown and treacherous, but that worked to their advantage. Mike guided the Jeep onto the narrow path, his movements deliberate and precise. "The mining company abandoned this site in the 90s, he explained, navigating between fallen rocks and encroaching vegetation. But before that, they built a network of maintenance roads all through these hills. Most people don't even know they exist anymore." Emily studied the terrain with growing understanding. Perfect for losing aerial pursuit. The tree cover combined with the elevation changes. "Exactly," Mike confirmed. "And there's something else." He nodded toward a series of deep shadows ahead. "The company blasted several tunnels that never got fully developed. They're stable, I've checked them myself, but they don't show up on any current maps." The sound of helicopter rotors echoed in the distance, still far away but growing closer. Mike could feel time pressing down on them like a physical weight. Every decision now could mean the difference between success and failure, between seeing Tommy again, or... He pushed that thought away, focusing instead on the path ahead. The rain continued its relentless assault, but up here, it had become an ally, obscuring their trail and limiting visibility for their pursuers. "Almost there," Mike said, his voice steady despite the tension. "Remember what I said about surprises? You're about to see one of my favorites." The real test of his preparations, and his decision to help Emily, was about to begin. As they approached one of the larger mine entrances, Mike activated another hidden switch on the custom console. The Jeep's exterior lights completely darkened, plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by the faint glow of the dashboard instruments. "There's a maintenance tunnel about 50 yards inside," Mike explained, his voice low as if the pursuing helicopters might somehow hear them. "It branches off from the main shaft, not on any official maps because it was dug after the surveys were filed. Found it during one of my exploration runs." Emily nodded, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The sound of rotor blades grew louder, but the dense canopy and driving rain still worked in their favor. "How often do you explore abandoned mines?" "Often enough," Mike replied, easing the Jeep forward. "Started after Sarah died. Needed something to focus on when Tommy was at school. These mountains are full of forgotten places if you know where to look." The Jeep's tires crunched over loose gravel as they entered the mine entrance. The darkness swallowed them completely, the air becoming noticeably cooler. Mike switched to the infrared system again, the tunnel walls taking on an eerie green glow through his modified visor. 10 yards ahead," he murmured. "The turn is subtle. Most people would miss it even in daylight." The Jeep crept forward, then turned into what appeared to be solid rock but was actually a narrow passage. This tunnel runs for about half a mile before connecting to another ventilation shaft. From there, we can access a whole different network of roads on the other side of the mountain. Emily's phone buzzed. "The helicopters are over our last known position," she reported. "Ground units are spreading out, trying to establish a perimeter." She paused, studying the screen. "They're good, professional. Military background, definitely." "Mercenaries?" Mike asked, navigating a particularly tight turn. "Ex-special forces, most likely. Hired by people who want our research." Emily's voice carried a note of bitter frustration. "We've had leaks before, but never this coordinated. Someone on the inside has to be helping them." The tunnel widened slightly, allowing Mike to stop the Jeep in a small alcove. He killed the engine, but left the electrical system running. In the dim green glow of the infrared, their faces looked ghostly. "We need to wait here for a few minutes," he explained. "Let them commit to their search pattern. The more resources they deploy looking for us up there, the better our chances when we emerge on the other side." Emily nodded, understanding the strategy. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sound of helicopters through the mountain rock. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "Why did you really help me tonight?" she asked. "Back at the shop, you could have turned me away, called the police, chosen the safer option." Mike was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "When Sarah was sick," he finally said, "strangers helped us. People who didn't have to, who gained nothing from it. They just helped. Because it was right." He adjusted the infrared visor, checking their surroundings. "I guess I learned that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice aren't the same thing." "Your son is lucky to have you," Emily said softly. "I'm the lucky one," Mike replied. "He gives me a reason to be better, to do better." He checked his watch. "Speaking of which, time to move. They should be fully committed to their search pattern by now." The Jeep's engine came back to life, its sound muffled by Mike's modifications. As they began moving deeper into the tunnel network, Emily's phone lit up again. "New problem," she announced, her voice tense. "They're bringing in thermal imaging equipment. military grade. If they sweep these tunnels. They won't find us, Mike interrupted, a hint of confidence returning to his voice. Remember those surprises I mentioned? He reached for yet another hidden switch. Let's show them why it pays to be paranoid. The real test of Mike's preparations and his years of seemingly excessive modifications was about to begin. As they drove deeper into the mountain's heart, the sound of pursuit faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of the engine and the weight of thousands of tons of rock above them. The night was far from over, but at least now they had a fighting chance. The Jeep's engine hummed steadily as Mike engaged his latest modification. A series of small vents opened along the vehicle's exterior, releasing a specialized cooling agent that would mask their thermal signature. It was an adaptation of technology he'd worked with during his military service, modified for civilian application. Thermal cloaking, Emily observed, clearly impressed. Similar to what we used in the prototypes, but more compact. You've improved the design. Had a lot of time to tinker, Mike replied, navigating through the dark tunnel. After Sarah passed, I couldn't sleep much. Started working on projects like this. Never thought I'd actually need them. The tunnel began to slope upward, the path becoming increasingly narrow. Mike's modifications to the Jeep's suspension system proved invaluable as they crawled over fallen rocks and decades of debris. The infrared system revealed every obstacle with crystal clarity, allowing him to plot the safest course. 2 minutes until we reach the ventilation shaft, he announced, checking a custom GPS unit mounted under the dash. Once we emerge, we'll have about 30 seconds before their thermal sweeps can pick us up. That's assuming they've maintained their current search pattern. Emily consulted her phone. They're still focused on the main entrance. 3 ground teams, 2 helicopters. She paused, frowning at the screen. Wait. They're calling in something else, larger aircraft coming from the north. Drone support, Mike guessed, his jaw tightening. They're escalating, which means they're getting desperate. He took another turn, the Jeep's tires finding surprising traction on the wet stone. That works in our favor. Desperate people make mistakes. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, an old equipment storage area, judging by the rusted machinery still visible in the infrared light. Mike brought the Jeep to a stop, killing the engine but leaving the electrical systems running. We need to wait here for a few minutes, he explained. Let me check something. He pulled out his phone, checking for a signal. 1 bar, weak, but enough. A text from Gloria appeared. Safe and sound. Tommy's asleep. Be careful. Relief flooded through him, followed quickly by a renewed sense of purpose. He showed Emily the message. My son's safe. Now let's make sure what you're carrying stays safe, too. Emily nodded, her professional demeanor softening slightly. You know, when we researched potential contractors for this project, your name came up. Your service record, your expertise with vehicle modifications. But what really stood out were the recommendations from your old unit. They said you were the one person they could always count on to find a way through impossible situations. Those were different times, Mike said quietly, but his mind was already working on their next move. The ventilation shaft ahead leads to an access road on the northern face of the mountain. It's steep, dangerous in this weather. They'll expect us to avoid it. Which is why we're going to take it, Emily concluded, understanding his logic. Exactly. But first, Mike reached into the back seat, pulling out a small case. Inside was a collection of small devices, each about the size of a coffee cup. More things I never thought I'd need to use. Magnetic pulse generators. Minimal range, but enough to disrupt their thermal imaging if we place them right. He quickly explained his plan. The generators, planted at specific points along their escape route, would create just enough electromagnetic interference to blind their pursuers' equipment. Not for long, but hopefully long enough. It's risky, Emily said, studying one of the devices. If the timing's off even slightly? Everything about tonight is risky, Mike replied, already moving to exit the Jeep. But sometimes the best path is straight through the worst weather. He paused, looking at her directly. My old CO used to say that, right before some of our most successful missions. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Colonel Anderson? Mike nodded. You knew him? He's the one who suggested we find you. She smiled slightly. Said you were the only one he knew who could match his level of paranoid preparation. Despite the situation, Mike found himself chuckling. Paranoid preparation kept us alive more than once. He checked his watch. Time to move. The longer we wait, the more assets they can bring in. As they prepared to execute their plan, Mike thought about Tommy, about Sarah, about all the turns his life had taken to bring him to this moment. He'd spent years building this vehicle, adding modifications that seemed excessive even to him at times. Now in the darkness of an abandoned mine, with helicopter searchlights sweeping the mountain above them and professional killers closing in, all that preparation was about to be put to the ultimate test. The next few minutes would determine not just their survival, but the security of whatever vital information Emily carried. Mike Reynolds, small-town mechanic and single father, was about to remind everyone, including himself, that he was still the soldier who never left a mission unfinished. The sound of helicopter rotors still echoed through the mountain as Mike and Emily prepared their countermeasures. Rain continued to pour outside the mine entrance, providing natural cover against both visual and thermal detection. Mike worked quickly, programming each pulse generator with practiced efficiency. These need to be precise, he explained, setting the timers. Too early, they'll know we're coming. Too late, they'll already have us on their scopes. His hands moved with the same careful precision he used when working on engines, each movement deliberate and exact. Emily watched him work, while monitoring her phone's display. Ground teams are expanding their search pattern. They're starting to consider the possibility of underground routes. She paused, studying new information. And that larger aircraft I mentioned? It's carrying signal jamming equipment, military grade. They really don't want you reaching that facility, Mike observed, finishing the last generator. Ready for the fun part? The plan was dangerous but simple. They would plant the generators at strategic points along their escape route, creating a corridor of electromagnetic interference. The Jeep's modified systems would protect their own electronics, while temporarily blinding their pursuers' thermal imaging and communication equipment. 5 minutes to get into position, Mike said, checking his watch. Then everything happens fast. He handed Emily 2 of the devices. Remember, magnetic bases high as you can reach. The interference field spreads downward. They moved quickly but carefully through the darkness, guided by the infrared system. The mine's damp walls glistened eerily in the green glow of their visors. Each generator had to be placed perfectly. Their lives would depend on the overlapping fields of interference they would create. As they worked, Mike's thoughts drifted to Tommy. His son had always been fascinated by his garage work, constantly asking questions about engines and tools. Like father, like son, Gloria would say. Mike wondered what Tommy would think if he could see his father now, setting up military-grade countermeasures in an abandoned mine. Last one, Emily called softly, securing her final generator high on a support beam. 3 minutes until synchronization. They hurried back to the Jeep. Mike did one final check of his modifications: the thermal masking system, the reinforced electronics, the custom navigation unit. Everything had to work perfectly for their plan to succeed. You know, Emily said as they got back in the vehicle, when I broke down outside your shop, it wasn't entirely random. She met his questioning look. We've been watching you, evaluating you for months. The breakdown was staged, a test to see how you'd react. Mike absorbed this information, not entirely surprised. And if I hadn't helped? We had other candidates, but you were our first choice. She smiled slightly. though I don't think anyone expected the situation to escalate quite this far. The first pulse generator activated with a subtle hum that they felt more than heard. Above them, the helicopter's searchlights flickered briefly. Their window was opening. "Time to move," Mike said, starting the engine. He engaged the thermal masking system and checked their route one final time on the GPS. The path ahead would take them up a nearly vertical service road in the middle of a storm while being pursued by professional mercenaries with military hardware. "Ready?" Emily secured her seatbelt, her expression determined. "Ready." The Jeep surged forward, its modified engine barely whispering despite the power it delivered. They emerged from the mine into the pouring rain just as the second pulse generator activated. Through the infrared visor, Mike could see the helicopter pilots struggling with their suddenly unreliable equipment. "Ground teams moving to compensate," Emily reported, watching her phone. "They're switching to night vision, trying to adapt." "Too late," Mike said with grim satisfaction as the third generator pulsed. Their carefully planned corridor of interference was forming, creating a blind spot in the pursuer's detection net. He turned the Jeep onto the steep access road, the modified suspension handling the brutal terrain with remarkable stability. Above them, the helicopters were flying erratic patterns, their thermal imaging systems giving them conflicting data. The pulse generators were working exactly as designed, creating just enough chaos to mask their escape. As they climbed higher into the stormy night, Mike allowed himself a moment of pride. Years of seemingly excessive preparation, of late nights spent modifying and improving his vehicle, were proving their worth. Sometimes paranoia wasn't paranoia at all. Sometimes it was just good planning. The real challenge still lay ahead, but for now, they had achieved the impossible. They had vanished right under the noses of their pursuers, using nothing but ingenuity, preparation, and a whole lot of rain. Copy retry, proceed next part, make sure it's 800+ words edit. The modified Jeep crawled steadily up the treacherous mountain access road, its tires finding grip where none should exist. Mike's years of experience and custom modifications were being pushed to their absolute limits as rain continued to pound against the windshield. The pulse generators they'd left behind were still doing their job, creating a protective corridor of electromagnetic interference. "First helicopter is pulling back, y'all," Emily reported, eyes fixed on her phone's display. "Their instruments are completely scrambled. Second one's trying to compensate by flying lower, but in this weather?" She didn't need to finish the thought. Flying low in mountainous terrain during a storm was suicide. Mike kept his focus on the hazardous path ahead, using every trick he'd learned during his military service and subsequent years of mountain driving. The infrared system revealed obstacles through the rain, but at these angles, even the best technology couldn't make the route any less dangerous. "Ground teams are regrouping," Emily continued her updates. "They're trying to establish a new perimeter, but the interference is forcing them to maintain wider distances than they'd like." She paused, studying new information. "The jamming aircraft is holding position. They're waiting for us to clear the interference zone." "Smart," Mike acknowledged. "They know we can't maintain this coverage forever. They're playing the long game." He guided the Jeep around a particularly treacherous bend, the vehicle's modified suspension keeping them stable despite the near-vertical drop to their right. A flash of lightning illuminated the mountainside, followed almost immediately by bone-shaking thunder. The storm was intensifying, as if nature itself was joining the fight. The rain had become so heavy that even with the infrared system, visibility was severely limited. "How much farther to the facility?" Mike asked, compensating for a sudden crosswind that threatened to push them toward the edge. 15 miles as the crow flies," Emily replied, "but in these conditions, with our planned route." She made some quick calculations. "At least 2 hours, assuming we don't run into any more complications." As if on cue, Mike's phone buzzed. A text from Gloria. "Company at the house. 2 men in suits. Didn't approach, just watching. We're still safe." Mike's jaw tightened. "They're covering all angles. Professional." He took another turn, the Jeep's tires spraying gravel into the darkness below. But they made one mistake. What's that? They're following their training too precisely. Military precision, military tactics. A grim smile crossed his face, which means they're not prepared for someone who knows those tactics but isn't bound by them. Emily studied him for a moment. You have another plan. They're expecting us to follow certain patterns, take certain routes, standard evasion protocols. Mike checked their position on the GPS. But what if we do something completely unexpected, something no reasonable person would attempt? Understanding dawned in Emily's eyes. The quarry, she said. The one we passed on the topographical map. It's been closed for decades. Mike nodded. Flooded during a storm 15 years ago. Created an underground lake system that connects to the river network. Most people think it's impassable. Most people would be right, Emily observed. The water levels, the currents, the confined spaces. It would be incredibly dangerous. Yes, Mike agreed, which is exactly why they won't expect us to go that way. He paused, glancing at her. But I need you to understand the risks. If anything goes wrong down there... Emily's expression hardened with determination. The data I'm carrying? It's worth the risk. Thousands of lives could depend on keeping it secure. Mike adjusted their course, taking them toward a barely visible side path that would lead to the abandoned quarry. The Jeep's headlights caught the reflective surface of old warning signs, their faded letters spelling out dangers and prohibitions. I did some exploration down there last year, he explained. Mapped out some of the underwater passages, made some modifications to the Jeep, just in case I ever needed to. He trailed off, realizing how crazy it must sound. In case you ever needed to escape through a flooded quarry while being chased by mercenaries? Emily finished, a hint of amusement in her voice despite their situation. Something like that. Mike checked their supplies. The real question is, do you trust me enough to try it? Emily looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Colonel Anderson said you were the best he'd ever seen at improvising solutions. Said you had a gift for finding paths where none existed. She squared her shoulders. So yes, I trust you. The Jeep continued its climb through the storm, but now with a new purpose. Behind them, their pursuers were regrouping, preparing for a long chase. They had no way of knowing that their quarry was about to vanish into one of the most dangerous underground water systems in the state. Sometimes, Mike reflected, the best escape route was the one that seemed impossible. He just hoped his preparations would prove sufficient for what lay ahead. The abandoned quarry loomed before them like a massive wound in the mountainside, its jagged walls disappearing into rain-filled darkness. Old equipment lay scattered around the entrance, rusted monuments to industrial ambitions long forgotten. Mike brought the Jeep to a stop behind a collapsed equipment shed, providing temporary cover from aerial observation. Our pulse generators will stop working soon, Emily noted, checking the time. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they regain full thermal imaging capability. Mike was already moving, pulling waterproof bags from a hidden compartment behind the Jeep's back seats. The quarry floods from the bottom up, he explained, extracting specialized diving gear. But there's a maintenance tunnel that stays partially dry. If we time this right, we can use the current water level to our advantage. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the quarry's vast interior. The storm-driven rain had created dozens of waterfalls along the rocky walls, all feeding into the dark pool below. The water level was higher than Mike had ever seen it, but that could work in their favor. Here, he said, handing Emily a sealed bag. Waterproof suit, rebreather system, emergency oxygen, military grade, but modified for confined spaces. He began donning his own gear with practiced efficiency. The Jeep's been adapted for limited underwater operation. Sealed engine, elevated air intake, specialized electrical systems. Emily examined the equipment with professional interest while changing into the waterproof suit. These modifications, they're beyond what most civilians could access, even with military experience. Mike paused in his preparations. Let's just say I kept in touch with some old contacts, people who understand the value of being over-prepared. He checked the rebreather systems, ensuring both sets were functioning perfectly. The route I mapped last year should still be navigable, but with these water levels, we'll be dealing with stronger currents. They worked quickly, securing their essential gear in waterproof containers. Mike's phone buzzed one last time. Another update from Gloria. All quiet at Safe House. Be careful down there. He sent back a brief acknowledgement, then sealed the phone in a waterproof case. The entrance we want is about 30 feet down, Mike explained, pointing toward the dark water. There's a series of interconnected maintenance tunnels that the mining company used for accessing deeper levels. Most of them flooded years ago, but they create a natural drainage system into the river network. And you've tested this route? Emily asked, adjusting her rebreather. Parts of it. Enough to know it's possible. Mike didn't mention that his previous explorations had been under much less dangerous conditions. The current will be strongest at the junction points. We'll need to use the Jeep's power to push through. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder. Their pursuers were beginning to close in as the electromagnetic interference faded. Mike did one final check of their equipment, then climbed back into the driver's seat. Emily joined him, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. Last chance to back out, he said, starting the engine. Once we go in, we're committed. The current only flows one way. Emily secured her harness. We've come this far. Besides, I don't see our friends up there giving us much choice. Mike nodded, then engaged a series of switches on the custom console. The Jeep's exterior lights switched to high-intensity underwater beams, and additional seals activated around the doors and equipment housing. A heads-up display activated on the windshield, showing depth readings and water pressure measurements. Remember, he said, moving the Jeep toward the water's edge, if anything goes wrong down there, the rebreathers will give us about the 30 minutes of air. The emergency beacons are pre-programmed with coordinates for 3 extraction points. You really did think of everything, Emily observed. Had to, for Tommy's sake. Mike took a deep breath, then eased the Jeep forward. Here we go. Try to stay relaxed. The first part is the most disorienting. The vehicle's front tires touched the water, then began to sink. The quarry pool was remarkably clear despite the rain, the underwater beams cutting through the darkness to reveal a ghostly landscape of submerged mining equipment and rock formations. The Jeep descended steadily, air bubbles streaming past the windows as the water rose around them. Above, the sound of helicopters grew distant and distorted as they submerged completely. Mike activated the underwater navigation system, its sonar pings revealing the entrance to the maintenance tunnel network. The real test of his preparations and their nerve was about to begin. In the beam of the underwater lights, the dark mouth of the tunnel waited to swallow them whole. The submerged tunnel engulfed them in an otherworldly darkness, broken only by the Jeep's powerful underwater lights. Mike guided the vehicle with careful precision, fighting against currents that threatened to slam them into the tunnel walls. The modified vehicle's engines hummed steadily, pumping out excess water and maintaining their air supply. Depth gauge shows 40 feet, Emily reported, monitoring the heads-up display. Current speed increasing, temperature dropping. Mike nodded, focusing on navigating through the narrow passage. The tunnel walls were rough-hewn rock, occasionally interrupted by old support beams and abandoned mining equipment. Their lights revealed a surreal landscape of mineral deposits and underwater formations that had developed over years of flooding. First junction coming up, Mike announced, checking the sonar display. This is where it gets tricky. The current, he was cut off as a powerful surge caught the Jeep, threatening to spin them sideways. Mike fought the controls, using the vehicle's modified thrusters to stabilize their position. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where several passages converged, creating a dangerous vortex of competing currents. Old mining carts and debris tumbled through the water around them, carried by the powerful flow. "Second tunnel from the left," he called out, wrestling with the steering. "It'll be a tight fit," but it leads to the river system. Emily gripped her harness as Mike maneuvered the Jeep through the chaotic currents. The vehicle's frame groaned under the pressure, but the reinforcements held. They pushed through the junction, the powerful engines fighting against the flow until they finally broke free into the next tunnel. "Signal check," Emily said, examining her specialized equipment. "No pursuit detected. The water's masking our trail completely." "They'll figure it out eventually," Mike replied, guiding them deeper into the tunnel network. "But by then, we'll be long gone, assuming we make it through the next section." The tunnel began to narrow, the walls closing in until they were just inches from the Jeep's sides. The current grew stronger, pushing them forward with increasing speed. Mike's modifications were being tested to their absolute limits. "How much air?" Emily asked, checking her own rebreather status. 20 minutes in the main system plus emergency reserves. Mike adjusted their course slightly, avoiding a partially collapsed section of tunnel. "We should reach the river outlet in 10, assuming nothing goes wrong." As if on cue, their lights illuminated a massive obstacle ahead. A collapsed support beam blocked most of the tunnel, creating a dangerous bottleneck. Water rushed through the narrow opening with tremendous force. "We can't stop," Mike said, his voice tense but controlled. "The current's too strong. We'll have to thread the needle." He began positioning the Jeep, using small bursts from the thrusters to align them with the gap. The entire vehicle vibrated as the current pulled them forward, increasing speed with each passing second. "If we don't make it," Emily started, but Mike cut her off. "We'll make it." His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before. "Just be ready with the emergency thrusters if we start to roll." The gap rushed toward them, the collapsed beam filling their view. Mike made microscopic adjustments to their approach, everything happening in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. The Jeep's reinforced frame scraped against rock with a sound that reverberated through their bones. For a moment they were wedged in place, the current threatening to tear the vehicle apart. Then, Mike engaged the full power of their engines, and with a violent lurch, they broke through. The tunnel beyond was wider, the current less aggressive. Their lights revealed natural rock formations now. They had transitioned from the man-made tunnels into the natural cave system that fed into the river. 5 minutes to the outlet, Mike announced, checking their oxygen levels. "Then we'll have about 30 seconds to surface between patrols." Emily nodded, already preparing their next moves. "The facility is 3 miles upstream from our exit point. I have a contact waiting, but we'll need to time this perfectly." The tunnel began to angle upward, and hints of natural light penetrated the murky water ahead. They had survived the most dangerous part of their underwater escape, but Mike knew the night was far from over. Somewhere above, their pursuers were undoubtedly regrouping, expanding their search patterns. But for now, they had achieved the impossible. They had vanished into the depths and found a path where none should exist. As they approached the tunnel's exit, Mike allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Sometimes, the craziest plans were the ones that worked best. The river waited ahead, along with whatever challenges would come next. But they were ready. They had to be. Through the murky water ahead, the tunnel's exit became more distinct. Natural light filtered down from the river's surface, creating shifting patterns that danced across the Jeep's hood. The vehicle's sonar system picked up the larger space of the river ahead, confirming they were almost out. 30 seconds to exit, Mike said, checking their final approach. "Remember, when we surface, we'll only have moments before the patrols might spot us." The current grew stronger as they neared the exit, the river's powerful flow already starting to pull at them. But after what they'd just survived, this felt almost manageable. The impossible part was behind them. Now came the precision. The Jeep burst from the underwater tunnel into the open river, its modified engines fighting against the powerful current. Natural light filtered through the water above them, a welcome change from the claustrophobic darkness of the mining tunnels. Mike kept them deep enough to avoid immediate detection while scanning for their exit point. "Surface patrols?" he asked, checking the sonar display for any unusual movement above. Emily consulted her equipment. 2 boats upstream, 1 downstream, all maintaining standard search patterns. She paused, studying new data. Helicopters are still focused on the quarry area. They haven't figured out our route yet. Mike nodded, guiding them toward a section of riverbank partially hidden by overhanging trees. The storm continued to rage above, which would work in their favor. The rain and wind would make aerial observation more difficult. "The facility contact," Mike said, adjusting their course. "You trust them?" "With my life," Emily replied. "Dr. Sarah Chen. She's been my handler since this project began. If she's compromised." She left the thought unfinished. The Jeep's oxygen systems showed 15 minutes of primary air remaining. More than enough, but Mike had learned never to take anything for granted. He checked their position against his mental map of the river. The extraction point was close. "When we surface," he explained, "we'll have about 45 seconds before the patrol boats come back around. The storm will give us some cover, but we'll need to move fast." Emily nodded, already preparing their essential gear for quick retrieval. The classified data she carried had remained secure in its waterproof case throughout their underwater journey. "There," Mike said suddenly, pointing through the windshield. A partially submerged fallen tree marked their exit point, its roots creating a natural screen from the river. Perfect cover for surfacing. He maneuvered the Jeep carefully behind the massive trunk, using it as a shield against the current. Above them, rain peppered the river's surface, creating a constantly shifting pattern of ripples that would help mask their emergence. "Patrol boats? D," he asked, making final preparations for surfacing. Emily checked her instruments. "Upstream boat is 3 minutes out, moving away. Downstream boat just past our position, heading south. Helicopters." She smiled slightly. "Still circling the quarry." Mike allowed himself a small grin. Sometimes the best plans were the ones that seemed too crazy to consider. The flooded quarry escape route, a contingency he'd prepared for but never truly expected to use, had worked perfectly. "Ready?" he asked, hand on the final control. Emily secured her gear and nodded. "Ready." The Jeep rose slowly at first, then broke the surface with a surprisingly gentle surge. Water cascaded from the modified vehicle as Mike guided it up the muddy bank, its wheels finding purchase on the slick ground. The overhanging trees and continuing storm provided natural concealment as they emerged fully from the river. "Signals coming back," Emily reported, checking her phone. "Dr. Chen confirms the pickup point is secure. 2 miles north, following the maintenance road." Mike engaged the Jeep's standard drive system, the vehicle transitioning smoothly from aquatic to terrestrial operation. Despite everything they'd just put it through, the machine performed flawlessly. All those years of modifications, of preparing for scenarios that seemed impossibly paranoid, had paid off. "We should reach the facility within 30 minutes, Emily continued. "Once we're inside their security perimeter." She paused as her phone buzzed with new information. Her expression tightened. "Mike, we have a problem." "See." "What kind of problem?" Dr. Chen's last message included a duress code. "The facility." She met his eyes. "It's compromised." Mike processed this information quickly, military training kicking in. If the facility was compromised, their entire plan needed to change. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think that his night of impossible escapes wasn't over yet. "Options?" he asked, already running through scenarios in his head. Emily's expression was grim but determined. "I know a fallback location. But getting there." She glanced at him. "How do you feel about mountain climbing in the rain?" Mike checked their remaining supplies, did a quick mental calculation of risks and resources. After driving through a flooded mine, mountain climbing sounds practically normal. They shared a moment of grim humor before reality settled back in. Their pursuers would eventually figure out their escape route. The facility they'd been heading for was no longer safe, and somewhere out there, a traitor was waiting to intercept them. The night was far from over, and their next challenge would make the underwater escape look simple by comparison. The maintenance road twisted through dense forest, mud spraying from the Jeep's tires as Mike navigated the treacherous terrain. The vehicle's waterproof systems had performed flawlessly during their underwater escape, but now they faced a different challenge. With the primary facility compromised, they needed a new plan, fast. "Talk to me about this fallback location," Mike said, scanning the darkness ahead. Despite the storm, he kept the headlights off, relying on the infrared system to avoid detection. Emily pulled up a topographical map on her specialized equipment. "There's an old weather research station, decommissioned in the 90s. The government maintained it as a cold site. Minimal power, basic supplies, completely off official records." She zoomed in on their target. "It's positioned near the peak of Mount Raven." "Mount Raven?" Mike's expression tightened. "That's not exactly an easy climb in perfect conditions, in this storm." "Exactly why they won't expect it," Emily replied. "The station has everything we need to secure the data and establish contact with my superiors. But reaching it?" She left the thought unfinished. Mike checked their supplies. The Jeep's hidden compartment still held emergency gear, climbing equipment, cold weather supplies, medical kits. His supposed paranoia was proving invaluable once again. "What about Dr. Chen?" he asked, taking a sharp turn to avoid a fallen tree. If she sent a duress code, she could be in danger. "Sarah can handle herself," Emily assured him, though concern flickered across her face. "She's more than just a scientist. Let's just say we've worked together in various capacities." A sudden crackle of radio traffic caught their attention. Emily quickly adjusted her equipment, intercepting the transmission. "They've found the tunnel exit," she reported grimly. "Ground teams are being redirected to the river. They'll have the area surrounded within 20 minutes. Mike processed this information, already formulating their next move. "The old logging trails lead partway up Mount Raven. We can use them to gain elevation before they close the net. After that..." He gestured at the steep, rain-soaked slopes ahead. "We climb." "The data has to reach that station," Emily said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The rain intensified as they turned onto an almost invisible trail that switchbacked up the mountain's lower slopes. The Jeep's modified suspension handled the brutal terrain admirably, but even Mike's extensive improvements had their limits. "Tell me about the station's defenses," he said, navigating around a washout that had taken half the trail with it. "What are we walking into?" "Automated security systems if they're still operational, reinforced walls, secure communications equipment." Emily checked her map again. "The real protection is its location. The only approach is up a near vertical rock face. Most people don't even know it exists." Mike's phone buzzed. Another update from Gloria. "Tommy's asking for you. Told him you're helping people, just like his mom used to do. Stay safe." The message squeezed his heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. Everything he did was for Tommy's future, including somehow this insane mission up a mountain in the middle of a storm. "We've got company," Emily announced suddenly. Her equipment had picked up multiple vehicles converging on their position. "They're splitting up, trying to cover all possible routes up the mountain." "Let them," Mike replied, a plan forming in his mind. "They'll expect us to take the most direct route to the peak. Instead..." He turned the Jeep onto an even narrower trail, one that seemed to lead away from their destination. "The quarry wasn't your only hidden route, was it?" Emily asked, understanding dawning in her eyes. "During my exploration runs, I mapped every trail, every possible escape route in these mountains." Mike allowed himself a small smile, including a few that don't officially exist. The trail ahead disappeared into thick forest, its entrance almost completely hidden by overgrown vegetation. To casual observers, it would appear to be a dead end. But Mike knew better. This hidden path, barely wide enough for the Jeep, would take them to a series of narrow ledges that circled around the mountain's eastern face. "It's not the easiest route," he admitted, "but it'll get us close to your climbing point while keeping us out of sight." Emily studied their new course on her map. "The searchers won't expect this. They'll waste time covering the standard approaches." Exactly. Mike engaged the Jeep's low-range gears as they started up the concealed trail. "But we need to move fast. This storm's getting worse, and mountain climbing in these conditions." He left the thought unfinished. Above them, Mount Raven's Peak was lost in storm clouds, its upper slopes occasionally visible during lightning flashes. Somewhere up there, a hidden station waited with the means to secure Emily's vital data. But reaching it would push their skills, equipment, and luck to the absolute limit. The night's challenges were far from over. In many ways, they were just beginning. The hidden trail proved to be more challenging than even Mike had remembered. The storm had transformed small streams into raging torrents that cut across their path, while fallen trees and loose rocks created constant obstacles. The Jeep's exceptional modifications were being tested to their absolute limits. 3 pursuit vehicles have reached the standard access road, Emily reported, monitoring their opponent's movements. "They're spreading out, establishing a search grid." She paused, studying new data. "The helicopters are being grounded due to the storm. At least something's working in our favor." Mike guided them around a particularly treacherous bend, the Jeep's tires mere inches from a sheer drop-off. The infrared system revealed the path ahead, but the rain made every surface treacherous. One mistake, one slip, and gravity would claim them instantly. "How much climbing gear did you pack?" Emily asked, eyeing the steep slopes above them. 2 full sets of alpine equipment, cold weather gear, emergency supplies. Mike navigated another hairpin turn. "Never thought I'd actually need it all at once." The trail suddenly ended at what appeared to be a solid rock face, but Mike knew better. He stopped the Jeep and killed the engine, letting the sound of rain fill the silence. "This is as far as we drive," he announced. "The rest is on foot." They worked quickly, gathering essential gear from the Jeep's various compartments. Mike had packed everything with military precision, each item carefully chosen for maximum utility and minimum weight. As they prepared, Emily kept monitoring their pursuers' movements. "They're establishing a perimeter around the mountain's base," she reported. "Standard containment protocol, but they're focusing on the western and southern approaches." "Because those are the logical routes," Mike nodded, checking their climbing harnesses. "Nobody in their right mind would attempt the eastern face in these conditions." "Good thing we're not in our right minds then," Emily replied with grim humor. Mike secured the last of their gear and did a final check of the Jeep's systems. He'd activated several security measures. Anyone trying to tamper with the vehicle would be in for some unpleasant surprises. "The rock face looks solid," he said, examining the wall before them. "But there's a hidden ledge system about 30 feet up. It curves around the mountain's shoulder, eventually leading to a series of natural chimneys. If we can reach those, we can make our way to the weather station without being spotted," Emily finished. She checked her secure data package for the 100th time. "Assuming we don't fall to our deaths first." Lightning flashed, illuminating the daunting climb ahead. The rain had made the rocks slick, and the wind was picking up strength as they gained elevation. Every aspect of their attempt seemed to defy common sense and basic survival instincts. Mike's phone buzzed one last time. Another message from Gloria. "Tommy's finally asleep. He made you a drawing of his brave dad helping people. Come back safe to see it." The message steeled his resolve. He secured the phone in a waterproof case and began final preparations for the climb. "I'll lead," he said, checking Emily's harness connections. "The first 30 feet are the most exposed. After that, we'll have some protection from the wind." Emily nodded, her expression determined. "How did you find this route?" "After Sarah died," Mike replied, double-checking their anchors. "I needed." Something started exploring these mountains, learning every possible path, every hidden route. He paused, securing their safety line. "Never thought I'd be using them to help protect classified military technology." Life has a way of surprising us, Emily observed, watching as Mike began placing their first climbing anchors. The wind howled around them as Mike started up the rock face, his movements careful and precise despite the rain. Each handhold had to be tested, each anchor point carefully selected. One mistake would be their last. Emily followed his lead, matching his movements with practiced skill that suggested her own training went well beyond standard military protocols. They worked in near-perfect synchronization, slowly but steadily making their way up the sheer cliff. Above them, somewhere in the storm-shrouded darkness, the weather station waited. Below, their pursuers continued to search the more obvious routes, unaware that their quarry was attempting the impossible. As they climbed higher, the wind grew stronger, and the rain seemed to strike with even greater force. But they pressed on, two figures moving steadily up the near-vertical face of Mount Raven, their progress hidden by darkness and storm. The night's greatest challenge was just beginning, and there was no turning back now. Their only option was up and into the heart of the storm, toward whatever awaited them at the summit. And somewhere in the back of Mike's mind, a small voice wondered if he'd finally pushed his luck too far. But he pushed that thought aside. They had no choice but to succeed. Too much depended on their success, including, somehow, the future security of the nation itself. The ascent became increasingly treacherous as they climbed higher into the storm. Rain pelted them horizontally, driven by fierce winds that threatened to tear them from their precarious holds on the mountain face. Mike led the way, each movement carefully calculated, while Emily followed his path with equal precision. "Ledge system ahead," Mike called out over the howling wind. "About 20 feet up. We can rest there before tackling the chimney section." Through her rain-soaked gear, Emily checked the data package once more. Still secure. "Ground teams have completed their perimeter," she reported. "They're starting a systematic sweep of all known trails." Mike found a solid handhold and tested it before proceeding. The rock was slick, but years of climbing these mountains had taught him every reliable grip point. Even in these conditions, his experience was proving invaluable. "How's your temperature?" he asked, noting how the wind chill had intensified with their elevation gain. "Managing," Emily replied, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "The weather station? How much further once we reach the chimney?" "About 800 feet of vertical climb," Mike estimated, securing another anchor point. "The chimneys will provide some shelter from the wind, but they're technically more challenging." A sudden gust nearly dislodged them, forcing both climbers to hug the rock face until it passed. Lightning flashed again, closer now, illuminating the dizzying drop below. Their pursuers' vehicles were barely visible through the storm, their searchlights sweeping the lower slopes in a systematic pattern. "They're starting to suspect something," Emily said, checking her equipment during a brief pause. "Chatter suggests they're calling in additional resources. They know we're still on the mountain." Mike reached the promised ledge and helped Emily up onto its relatively secure surface. The outcropping was just wide enough for them to sit and rest briefly, protected somewhat by an overhanging rock formation. "How's the data package holding up?" Mike asked, checking their remaining gear while they had the chance. Emily patted her secure backpack. "Still sealed. These containers were designed to withstand extreme conditions." She peered up through the rain. "The chimney system, you've climbed it before?" "Twice," Mike admitted, "but never in conditions like this." He checked his watch, calculating time and distance. "The storm's actually working in our favor in one way. The lightning's keeping their air support grounded. Without helicopters, they can't spot us on this face." A crackling transmission came through Emily's equipment. "All units, be advised. Thermal imaging shows recent vehicle activity on an unmapped trail on the eastern slope. Converge and investigate." "They've found the Jeep," Emily translated grimly. Mike nodded, already preparing for their next climb. "Sooner than I expected, but it doesn't change anything. They'll waste time examining the vehicle while we gain elevation." The wind howled around their small refuge, carrying stinging rain and the distant sound of thunder. Above them, the chimney system was barely visible, a series of vertical cracks in the mountain face that would lead them toward their goal. "The weather station's defenses," Mike said, adjusting Emily's climbing gear. You're sure they'll still be operational? The facility was designed to maintain minimal functions indefinitely, Emily replied. Solar power, backup generators, automated security systems. Even if it's been untouched for years, the core systems should be active. Mike secured their safety lines for the next phase of the climb. The chimney system would be both their salvation and their greatest challenge, offering protection from the wind but demanding perfect technique in increasingly difficult conditions. We'll climb in stages, he explained, checking their anchors one final time. The first chimney connects to a narrow traverse, then 2 more vertical sections. After that, he gestured upward into the storm. The station should be just beyond the ridgeline. Emily checked her own gear, her movements showing professional competence. And if the station's security systems don't recognize us? Then we'll have climbed this mountain in a hurricane for nothing, Mike replied with grim humor. But right now, let's focus on the climb. One impossible thing at a time. They began their ascent into the chimney system, their progress now hidden even from the searchers below. The vertical crack provided some shelter from the wind, but water poured down its length, making every move treacherous. As they climbed higher into the storm-lashed darkness, Mike couldn't help but think about Tommy, about the drawing waiting for him. His son thought he was out helping people, just like his mother used to do. He only hoped he could live up to that simple, profound faith. The night still held more challenges, more impossible tasks to overcome. But for now, they climbed. 2 figures ascending through wind and rain, determination driving them upward toward whatever awaited them at the summit of Mount Raven. Their pursuers continued to search below, unaware that their quarry was attempting something no sane person would consider. Sometimes, Mike reflected, the best path was the one that seemed utterly impossible. He just hoped this impossible path led to something more than just another dead end in the storm. The chimney system proved even more challenging than Mike had anticipated. Water cascaded down the vertical cracks, turning every handhold into a potential disaster. They climbed in stages, securing multiple anchor points, their progress slow but steady despite the deteriorating conditions. Second chimney ahead, Mike called down to Emily. The traverse between them is going to be tricky. He paused at a relatively secure position, checking their safety lines. How are you holding up? I'm good, Emily replied, though exhaustion was evident in her voice. The data package is still secure. She reached his position and took a moment to check their pursuers' movements. Ground teams are focusing on the Jeep location. They've found your hidden trail. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the sheer face of Mount Raven. They were now high enough that the clouds seemed within reach, the storm's fury even more intense at this elevation. The wind howled through the rock formations, creating an eerie whistling that seemed to warn them away. The traverse is about 30 feet, Mike explained, studying their next challenge. The crack narrows significantly. We'll need to move sideways along a ledge barely wide enough for our toes. Emily nodded, conserving energy by keeping responses minimal. The climb was taking its toll on both of them, but they couldn't afford to rest for long. Their pursuers would eventually figure out their route. Mike began the traverse, his movements precise despite fatigue and treacherous conditions. Each step had to be perfect. The ledge was indeed barely wide enough for their boots, and the rock face offered minimal handholds. Keep your weight against the wall, he instructed as Emily followed. Let the safety line take some of the strain if you need to. Halfway across the traverse, Emily's equipment crackled with an intercepted transmission. All teams be advised, weather station detected on thermal imaging at summit. Repeat, possible structure detected at peak. Proceed with caution. They've found it, Emily said grimly. Sooner than expected. Doesn't matter, Mike replied, continuing his careful movement along the ledge. They still have to reach it, and the only other approach would be suicide in these conditions, Emily finished. Like what we're doing now? Despite their situation, Mike allowed himself a grim smile. Exactly. Sometimes the crazy route is the only viable option. They completed the traverse and began ascending the second chimney. This one was narrower than the first, forcing them to press against opposite walls and inch upward. The technique required intense concentration and constant adjustment of position. "Tell me about Tommy," Emily said suddenly, her voice strained with effort. "What's he like?" Mike understood she was trying to keep them both focused, using conversation to fight fatigue. Too smart for his own good sometimes, loves taking things apart to see how they work. Usually manages to put them back together too. "Sounds like his father," Emily observed, following his climbing pattern. "More like his mother," Mike corrected. Sarah was a pediatric surgeon. She could fix anything: machines, people, broken spirits. Tommy has that same instinct to help, to understand, to make things better. The conversation died as they focused on a particularly challenging section. The chimney narrowed further, the wet rock making every movement increasingly dangerous. Their muscles burned with effort, but neither dared show weakness. "Station security protocols," Mike said between careful movements. "What should we expect?" "Automated defensive systems first," Emily replied. "Then biometric scanning. The facility is designed to appear abandoned while maintaining full operational capability." Another intercepted transmission crackled through. "Teams in position on all accessible approaches. No visual on targets." A grid of laser points swept over them, analyzing their positions and presumably their identities. "Don't move," Emily instructed. "Let it complete the scan." They clung to the rock face, muscles screaming with fatigue, as the security system decided their fate. The seconds stretched into an eternity, punctuated by thunder and the constant howl of wind. Finally, another mechanical announcement. "Identity confirmed. Dr. Emily Harrison. Security level Alpha. Welcome protocol initiated." A section of the rock face above them began to move, revealing a concealed entrance. Warm light spilled out into the storm. Salvation, just yards away. "Final push," Mike grunted, finding new strength. "Before they spot the lights. Gandur Sain Jasa." They climbed with desperate energy, knowing their position was now more exposed than ever. The station's entrance provided a fixed goal, but also made them more visible to the searchers below. Emily's equipment crackled again. "Movement detected on east face. All teams converge. Repeat. Targets spotted on east face." "They see us," Emily confirmed unnecessarily. Mike didn't waste breath responding. Every ounce of energy went into the final climb. The entrance was tantalizingly close now, just a few more moves. A spotlight beam cut through the darkness below, sweeping upward. They had seconds before it reached their position. "Inside," Mike ordered, making one final push to reach the entrance. "Now!" They practically dove through the opening, rolling onto solid flooring, just as the spotlight illuminated their previous position. The rock face sealed behind them automatically, leaving them in blessed stillness broken only by their heaving breaths. "Security perimeter intact," the station's system announced. "All defensive measures active. Welcome to Echo Station Alpha." They lay there for a moment, adjusting to the sudden absence of wind and rain. The station's interior was surprisingly well maintained, clean, climate-controlled, with various monitoring systems showing active status on wall-mounted displays. "The data," Emily said finally, checking her sealed package. "We need to get it secured immediately." Mike nodded, slowly getting to his feet. His muscles protested every movement, but training kept him alert. "What about our friends outside?" Emily moved to a control panel, her fingers flying over the interface. The station's stealth systems are fully operational. To their instruments, this entire section of the mountain is just solid rock. "And if they try a physical breach?" "Multiple automated defense systems," she replied. "Plus, the station can initiate a complete lockdown. Nothing gets in or out without proper authorization." Mike checked his phone, somehow still functional in its waterproof case. A message from Gloria awaited. "All clear here. Tommy's still sleeping soundly. You okay?" He sent a brief confirmation, then turned his attention to their surroundings. The station was larger than it appeared from outside, with corridors leading deeper into the mountain. "We need to secure the data first," Emily said, watching him examine the facility. "Then I can show you why it was worth risking our lives to protect." A distant explosion echoed through the mountain. Their pursuers had apparently decided to try forcing their way up the cliff face. "Won't work," Emily commented, leading the way toward what appeared to be a high-security area. "This facility was designed to withstand much worse than they can throw at it." Mike followed her, his military training keeping him alert despite exhaustion. They had reached their goal, but his instincts told him the night wasn't over yet. Something about this situation still felt unfinished. "The data you're carrying," he said as they walked. "It's more than just vehicle technology, isn't it?" Emily paused at a security door, her expression confirming his suspicion. "Much more," she admitted. "What I'm about to show you, it could change everything. Not just military technology, everything." The door opened, revealing a room filled with advanced equipment. And there in the center, something that made Mike's exhaustion vanish instantly, because what he was seeing should not have been possible. The night's greatest revelations were just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.